we'll look at Aquinas in a few minutes, but again, pretty much this selection from Paley is in the supplemental readings folder in Blackboard. So if you don't have your book yet, you'll be able to get that. Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to read part of it just to, and I guess since I have the microphone, I may as well do that. Okay. This is page 63. And the design argument is, from a logical perspective, it is not like the ontological argument, in that it is not supposed to be an airtight deductive argument, where if the premises are true, it would be a contradiction to accept the premises and reject the conclusion. Basically, the design argument is a probabilistic argument. It's not meant to establish its conclusion, namely that God exists, as designer, with the kind of certainty that you have in a mathematical axiom, but it's more a probabilistic type of certainty. Now, there are a number of different kinds of what are called probabilistic arguments, these are also called inductive, I-N-D-U-C-T-I-V-E, inductive arguments. And I-N-D-U-C-T-I-V-E, as opposed to deductive. The ontological argument is a deductive argument. In other words, if the premises are true, it would prove its conclusion with mathematical certainty. In other words, it would be an outright contradiction to accept the premises as true and reject the conclusion. Whereas in an inductive argument, you don't contradict yourself by accepting the premises as true, and thinking the conclusion is false. So the design argument has as a conclusion that probably, or that there's a high probability that God exists as designer. At least that's the best it can do. Okay? Now, there are various types of inductive arguments, and if you're wondering what they are, you can sign up for one of our logic courses. We're not really going to go into those, but the type of argument that characterizes a design argument it's called an argument from analogy. Now, an allegory is very similar to an analogy. Basically, an argument from I used to be able to speak the English language fluently. An argument from an analogy, from analogy basically says that two things are alike in certain respects, right? In other words, your premises of the argument say, okay, I'm comparing two things and they're alike in respects A, B, and C. And so those are your premises, pointing out how something is like something else. But then your conclusion then is that, Well, if they're alike in respects A, B, and C, then they're probably also alike in a further respect. You can call that Z or D. And so that's the form of an argument from analogy. You know, you're saying that two things are alike in some ways, and you're trying to establish that they're alike in another way. Okay? Now, there's another point that is made. The design argument has another name. It's a nice 50-cent word. Again, if anybody hasn't taken the objective. It's also called the teleological argument. The word telos means end or goal or purpose. In other words, the final end at which something aims. It's the, I mean, one of the famous, in Christianity, one of the 7 last words of Christ from the cross, it is finished. The Greek word there is teleio. You know, the whole thing is finished. We've reached the end. And so, basically, the teleological or design argument emphasizes the fact that there seem to be purposes in nature, that various things in the natural world seem to fulfill a purpose. And as we're going to see, Paley points out this as the chief difference between the watch that he finds and a stone that just happens to be laying there. That, you know, what makes the watch different is it has a series of parts that seem to move together to enable the watch to fulfill a particular purpose, in this case, enabling us to use it for telling time, right? So let's. I'm going to read the first about 2 paragraphs here. Again, this is in 63, but basically the same selection is in your book. And, oh, I was going to say, Natural Theology, Paley's book, the book from which this comes, you'll see the footnote down at the bottom of 63. It's actually a more interesting book than a lot of other philosophy books, in that, unlike most philosophy books who don't have any or many diagrams or pictures, that's something you won't find in many philosophy books. In Paley's Natural Theology, you get a lot of diagrams, because he not only talks about the human eye as an example of what he thinks is design, but Paley also talks about other parts of the human anatomy and other parts of animals and plants that he thinks are also features of them that show evidence from his perspective of design. That is, that they work together to fulfill a function. Okay. Now, Paley's British, see. Here we cross a field. You know, if you're in Britain, you cross a heath. In crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. Right, stone could have been there forever. But then Paley goes on, but suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer which I had before given, that for anything I knew, the watch may have just always been there. And he says, yet why should not this answer serve for the watch as well as for the stone? Why is it not as admissible in the second case as in the first? And so here's where he brings in the idea of telos, or purpose. Paley says, why? Why are they different? For this reason and for no other, namely that when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive what we could not discover in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose. For example, that they are so formed and adjusted as to produce motion, and that motion so regulated as to point out the hour of the day, that if the different parts had been differently shaped from what they are, or placed after any other manner, or in any other order than that in which they are placed, either no motion at all would have been carried on in the machine, or none which would have answered the use that is now served by it. Now, he goes into excruciating detail about the inner workings of the watch. Now, Paley talks in some of these Roman numerals, he tries to answer various possible objections. He says, nor would it, I apprehend, weaken the conclusion. Well, okay, hold it. Let me back up here. Let me get to his conclusion. The last few sentences in that paragraph. This mechanism being observed, and he's just described, as I said, in excruciating detail, the various parts of a watch. Now, obviously, digital watches weren't around then. You know, this is one with wheels and gears and stuff. This mechanism being, remember, we're talking 1802. This mechanism being observed, it requires indeed an examination of the instrument and perhaps some previous knowledge of the subject to perceive and understand it. But being once, as we have said, observed and understood, the inference, we think, is inevitable. What inference? What conclusion do we draw from all this? Namely this, that the watch must have had a maker, unlike the stone, right? In other words, it's composed of these parts that have to function in exactly the right way, or the thing doesn't work. And so the idea is that the watch must have had a designer, a maker, to design it and build it such that all of these parts work together to fulfill the intended purpose, right? So he says, the inference, the conclusion that the watch must have is that the watch must have had a maker, that there must have existed at some time and at some place or other an artificer or artificers who formed it, that is, craftsperson, who formed it for the purpose which we find it actually to answer. In other words, here's where telos comes in. This watch seems to have parts that work together to fulfill a particular purpose. And he says, well, the inference then is that somebody had to design it so that those parts move together in that exact way for it to fulfill that purpose. So there must have been a designer, an artificer, who formed it for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who comprehended its construction and designs its use. Okay? And again, he goes over various things. He said it wouldn't weaken his conclusion if we had never seen a watch made. He says it wouldn't invalidate our conclusion if the watch wasn't perfect, if it sometimes went wrong, or that it seldom went exactly right. If it wasn't a great watch, still, he says it would show evidence of design. So he says it also, in 3, wouldn't weaken the conclusion if we didn't know the purpose of all the parts. And now 4 is very important because Hume focuses on this, and frankly, the post-Darwin response to the design argument very much focuses on what you see in Roman numeral 4 on page 65. He says, nor fourthly would any man in his senses think that the existence of the watch with its various machinery accounted for. I'm sorry, that I didn't read it with the right inflection. Nor would any man in his senses think that the existence of the watch with its various machinery accounted for by being told that it was one out of possible combinations of material forms, that whatever he had found in the place where he found the watch must have contained some internal configuration or other, and this configuration might be the structure now exhibited, namely of the works of a watch as well as of a different structure. In other words, Paley is convinced, but of course people who are influenced by Darwin are not convinced, that Paley's convinced that we wouldn't think the watch accounted for by just saying that there are natural principles in nature that work together to and have worked together to produce it. So he says, we would be pretty sure that that the watch is not accounted for by anything else other than design. Now, in 7, at the end of 7, first of all, he doesn't think that we could point out a law of nature that would lead us to this conclusion. Either. So if we look at 66, okay, thank you. On page 66, where he says the application of the argument, here he kind of brings it down. He says, every indication of contrivance. Here, contrivance is another word for design. In other words, that something was designed, was contrived, put together to fulfill these functions. He says, every indication of contrivance, we could also read every indication of design, every manifestation of design which existed in the watch exists in the works of nature. So here is where he gives us the conclusion of the analogy, right? He's saying, okay, the watch is like various other things in nature, in that the watch has parts that work together to fulfill a purpose. And now, he's going to say, well, there are other things in nature, like the human eye, the human ear, that seem to be very analogous to the watch, right? The human eye has parts that work together, function together to fulfill a particular purpose. So let me finish reading this paragraph. So he says, every manifestation of design which existed in the watch exists in the works of nature, like the eye, the ear, with the difference on the side of nature being greater and more, and that in a degree which exceeds all computation. In other words, things in nature are even more complicated than the watch. I mean, says Paley, that the contrivances of nature surpass the contrivances of art or human design in the complexity, subtlety, and curiosity of the mechanism, and still more, if possible, do they go beyond them in number and variety, yet in a multitude of cases are not less evidently mechanical, not less evidently contrivances, not less evidently accommodated to their end or suited to their office. In other words, here's purpose, that things in nature like the ear and the eye are suited to their end of being able, of enabling us to hear and see. Not less evidently accommodated to their end or suited to their office than are the most perfect productions of human ingenuity. So basically, what you get here then is, you see how the analogy goes, right? Okay, what was unique about the watch that we didn't notice in the stone? It had parts that work together to enable it to fulfill a purpose or function, hence telos, purpose, the design, the teleological argument. There are other things in nature like the eye and the ear that also, like the watch, seem to be composed of parts that work together to fulfill a function or purpose. And then Paley says, well, we would conclude about the watch, because of this, what we would not conclude about the stone, that the watch must have had a designer and builder to design it to fulfill those particular purposes. And hence, other contrivances, other things in nature, like the eye and the ear, also needed a designer. There's your conclusion, right? just as the watch needed a designer, so things in nature needed a designer. But who would the designer of the eye or the ear be if not God, right? Hence, probably God exists as the designer of things in nature which seem to fulfill functions or purposes, Again, it's a probabilistic argument. It's an argument from analogy, but many people think it's a powerful analogy. I knew a medical doctor at the University of Virginia who, while his entire Christian faith did not rest on anything like the design argument, was absolutely convinced that it was, a very significant not airtight, but argument that convinced him. And elsewhere, Paley says, and I think it's in the selection that I cut out for you, in the readings part, I go. See, I'm a better selector than Solomon, if I may say so myself. I actually go later in his book where he makes the points that he wants to make about the human eye. And Paley really gets a lot of mileage out of the human eye. At one point he says, look, if there weren't any other evidence of design in nature than the human eye, just that, he says, would be enough to make us conclude that it needed God as its designer and maker. So Paley, so where he says some things about the human eye, that's actually in that supplementary readings part. So Aquinas' 5 ways are actually proofs, and you see this on page 66, proofs of God. The first 3 are examples of what is called the cosmological argument, the argument that says a first cause of the cosmos, the universe, was needed, and that God is most likely needed as first cause of the universe. There are versions of that. And the 4th way I don't even get into. But the 5th way is a very simple statement done, maybe 700 or 800 years before Paley of the design argument. And in this PowerPoint, where I have the ological argument, and again, I really need to separate these 2 out. Somehow, sometimes you get an idea, and it seems brilliant to you at the time, and for some reason it seemed to me brilliant to put the ontological argument and Aquinas' 5 ways, or at least 4 of his 5 ways, on the same PowerPoint, And now my attitude about it is, well, what was I thinking? Why didn't I make them separate? But at any rate. But here's the 5th way, and you have the reading there. And so we're going to kind of go through this. So the 5th way is another statement of the design argument, and that is that things in nature not having understanding or intelligence themselves, nonetheless seem to act to fulfill particular ends or goals or purposes. Now, instead of trotting out a watch, I don't even know if there were watches around then with gears and stuff. Aquinas, we'll see, illustrates things with an archer. But lacking intelligence, they cannot direct themselves toward this goal. In other words, he's saying, and notice, we could even say this about, say, a modern guided missile or smart bomb. You'd say, well, it can direct itself toward its goal. You know, I remember, you know, pictures in the first Gulf War in the 1990s. We had smart bombs that were so good that we could send them down a chimney of a big building and blow the thing up, you know, almost like you saw the conclusion of the first Star Wars movie ever made, where they, you know, shoot something down a vent. So the point is, even for something with a brain in it, somebody had to design the computer that goes in those things. Okay? Is somebody talking on the phone? Folks, guys, it's louder than you think, and it's more distracting than anything. And I have, on many occasions, had people complain in the front that somebody's talking in the back and it's hard for them to hear, you know. So, you know, have some consideration for your fellow classmates. Okay, so Aquinas illustrates this idea of goal-directedness by talking about an archer who's shooting an arrow at a particular target, right? He says, lacking intelligence, an arrow can't direct itself toward its target by itself. And even if a smart bomb can, or a missile, still, it had to be programmed to do that. So the arrow must be directed to it by an intelligent archer. In other words, to achieve a particular end, in this case, hitting the target correctly or hitting the bullseye, the arrow couldn't just do it itself. It had to be directed toward that goal or end. Hence, telos comes in to this version of the argument by an intelligent author. So likewise, things in nature that fulfill a goal or purpose, and here we get the kinds of things that Paley's talked about, right? You know, particular organs in the human body, in the body of animals, other things in plant. Things in nature that fulfill a goal or purpose can't direct themselves to do this by themselves. They need to be directed by an intelligent designer. And who would this intelligent designer be other than God? You know. Now, I'm going to not go into this, but one of the things that Hume says is that the conclusion that the designer of the world is perfect, we saw the traditional attributes of God with the ontological argument, doesn't necessarily fall out of the design argument, because you know, if there are imperfections in this world, why should we conclude logically that an imperfect world was the product of a perfect designer? You know, Hume says that's not a justified logical inference. Now, that was one of Hume's replies that I put in this slide. So you can look at that, but look at the Hume selection for next time on page 67 and you know, and following, about page 67 to 69. And I made visible to you a PowerPoint on Hume's criticisms of the design argument. I said he thought so much of them that it was one of the 3 things at the end of his life that he wanted to be remembered for. And in fact, this version of the design argument was not published until after Hume's death, at Hume's urging. He would not allow his publisher to publish the book, 3 Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, while he was still alive, because he didn't want to deal with the negative feedback from it. But it was published after his death. That'll let you know how controversial the book was, and it was, and even to this day. But Hume has one of the historically, maybe he has the historically most important case against the design argument. And the question is, since David Hume published, about 25 years before Paley, did Hume do Paley's argument in before Paley ever published it? Some people think he did. You may or may not agree. Okay, so we will go over the test on Friday, but your grades, I'm going to try everything I can to get them in. And by the way, I was very pleased with the essays, most of the essays I got from people. I'm going to try to get everything in by the deadline tonight, so maybe Thursday they'll make your midterm grades viewable to you. Okay, thank you, and we'll see you on Friday. Again, next week, no classes at all, spring break all next week. But Friday is a class day, okay?
And then Monday we don't come?
That's right. Not Monday, not Wednesday, not Friday.
Okay. Will we come back that following Monday?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.